Estás viendo Canal América, televisión dominicana para el mundo.
A Time for True show is sponsored by the Office of Dr. Bernard Fialkoff, a periodontal, dental implant and laser specialist in New York City, for over 40 years. Dr. Fialkoff was honored by the International College of Dentists and Pierre Fauchard, and received the Presidential Lifetime Humanitarian Honor from the White House. Call us at 718-229-3838.
Sometimes life can be so damn hard. You don't know where to go. Everything keeps falling apart. Yeah. You try to do your best, but only God knows that you've given everything you've got, but the world takes you down. You just keep moving on. Let your fears.
Welcome to A Time for True show. I'm your host, Dr. Bernard Fialkoff, and it's a pleasure to be back with you again tonight. And we're going to be dealing with something that's been changing over the years. When I was a teenager, and before that, in my middle years of childhood, we'd go out, we'd get into trouble. And sometimes in school, we acted up a little bit. And things seemed to be different back then. It seemed like that was a normal part of childhood, that you were learning, you were testing your boundaries. And sure, you got disciplined. I remember many times getting disciplined by my mother, my father, my friends, the same thing with their parents. It wasn't taboo. And it seemed like we all turned out well. And if we look overall at America, it seems like America was doing very well. And over the years, since I'm a health practitioner and a doctor or surgeon over 40 years, I've seen things change. And as they changed, I said to myself, but it doesn't seem like our country's improving. And so tonight's show is going to deal with a little bit of that. And we're very lucky to have with us a very important and knowledgeable man, Robert Whitaker, engineer. If you put his photos up on the screen, and we'll introduce Mr. Whitaker, who's an American journalist and author. He's won numerous awards as a journalist covering medicine and science, including the George Polk Award for medical writing and the National Association for Science Writers Award for Best Magazine Article. He started as a science reporter for the Albany Times-Union newspaper in New York. And in 1998, he co-wrote a series on mental illness and treatment for the Boston Globe that was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize for public service. His first book, Mad in America, was named by Discover magazine as one of the best science books of 2002. And Anatomy of an Epidemic won the 2010 Investigative Reporters and Editors Book Award for Best Investigative Journalism. He's the founder and publisher of madamerica.com, that features research news and blogs by an international group of writers. Mr. Whitaker is also clinical assistant adjunct professor at the Lewis Katz School of Medicine at Temple University. And engineer, if you will, let's bring him up live on the screen. And a bit of warm welcome to Mr. Robert Whitaker. Welcome, sir.
Well, thank you for having me tonight. It's a pleasure being here.
It's a pleasure is mine, and as the viewers hear you, they're going to hear why I'm saying that. And so let's get right to it, because there's a lot we need to cover. So first I wanted to ask you just a little bit about you. How did you decide on journalism as your career?
Well, it was sort of accidental, if you want to know the truth. After I graduated from college, I spent about 10 years writing fiction. I really wanted to be a novelist, and I had just enough success to keep on failing at it. By that, I mean I published a lot of short stories, but finally I had two kids and I needed to earn a living. And so I was living in a very small town in upstate New York, and I just got a job with the local paper when I was in my early 30s, and that's how I got started. It was just a secondary path to becoming a novelist.
Well, you know what? It sounds very familiar to me because I did the same kind of thing when I first started out in my profession, and I had a family and bills to pay. So I can sympathize and empathize, and it's totally real. Now, I wanted to ask you, because there's nearly 65 million Americans, or 1 in 5 Americans, according to statistics, taking prescribed mental health medications. And what I wanted to ask you, because you're a prolific author on this and researcher, what's your take, and if you could tell our audience, what's going on in our country?
Well, to really understand what's going on, you have to go back to 1980. And the reason I say that is that's when the American Psychiatric Association published the 3rd edition of its Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. And when they did that, they had a new conception. Before this, it was understood that oftentimes you have setbacks in life. Things go wrong for you and you have a time of difficulty and then you'll get better. But what the American Psychiatric Association decided in 1980 was we're going to call all these struggles people can have, depression, grief, whatever, and if kids are misbehaving in school, we'll call these diseases of the brain. And we're going to say that's due to fuels that are amiss in the brain, but there was no science behind this sort of reconceptualization of the difficulties that human beings experience. And once they described them as diseases of the brain, now drug companies could get FDA approval for all these different sort of ills we have, including ills, not just sort of really severe ills like you might have seen of people in asylums prior to this time, but ordinary things that happen to children, to happen to everybody's periods of depression, periods of sadness, that sort of thing. And suddenly they're going to decide to say, these are all diseases. Drug companies can get drugs approved now for unhappiness in essence. And once you have that, what happens is you have drug companies promoting this idea that mental disorders are going undiagnosed, and we have all these effective treatments. Of course, we heard they were due to chemical imbalances in the brain. The drugs fix those chemical imbalances. Now, that wasn't a true science story, but it was a great marketing story. And the American Psychiatric Association also wanted to promote this story of diseases of the brain because it elevated their prestige in society. Now they were doctors in white coats. And so really what you have to see is, oh, by the way, when they publish DSM-3, they're going to say there's 250 different disorders. And basically, they wanted a manual that allowed them to diagnose anybody who came into their office. So what happened is we had an expansion of a commercial enterprise designed to sell drugs via psychiatric diagnoses. And you have drug companies paying money to academic psychiatrists to be their advisors, consultants, and key opinion leaders. And beginning with the arrival of Prozac in 1987, which was heralded as this breakthrough medication, we get this great expansion of the psychiatric enterprise. We start diagnosing our children with all sorts of disorders. We start diagnosing a lot more people with depression. By the way, depression used to be a fairly infrequent disorder. Now, of course, it seems like 15% of the population qualifies for it. So you can't understand this, what I like to call the psychiatrization of American society, without understanding that it was an economic story, a story about drug companies building markets for their drugs with the assistance of the American Psychiatric Association. And that's why we're here today. It's not that, I mean, there are some difficult things today, but it's not just like, I'll give you real quick numbers. In 1987, we in the United States spent $800 million on psychiatric drugs. In 2007, we spent $40 billion, a 50-fold increase in the market size. Now, that's a very successful capitalistic story, right? You've expanded the market for products. But unless you understand it as a commercial story, it just doesn't make sense. This rapid psychiatrization of our society, where kids are taking drugs, people of all ages are taking drugs, psychiatric drugs, elderly people are taking psychiatric drugs. It's because they've sold this story to the public, which gets us all reaching for pills, or so many, thinking that they can solve all our ills, all our emotional difficulties.
It's unbelievable. As a surgeon in my field, I see things in my office at times because I've been in practice so long that people come to me to solve things that weren't done properly. And when I first started my practice, I thought that just what I learned is what you did, and I thought that was commonplace. And over the years, I've seen that, that by doing what you were taught, that was based on real science, not factitious, that made you unique and a leader in your field. And so I guess what you're saying is the same thing has happened in the field of mental health, is that it's really not based on science then.
No, listen, as often said, there are no biological markers. So you can't take a biological test and says this person has depression, this person has bipolar disorder, this person has ADHD. Those are all, and by the way, this is not a criticism or a critique that's coming from outside the profession. If you actually talk to people who were involved in creating the DSM, they'll say this: they're constructs. We constructed sort of symptom checklists, and without any, they would just say, well, okay, let's say there's 9 symptoms of depression. Well, how many of you should you have before you get a diagnosis? Should it be 3? Should it be 4? Should it be 5? They just arbitrarily said 5, for example. And basically, so that's the first problem. The diagnosis is a construct. It's not something found in nature. That doesn't mean people aren't struggling or don't have difficulties, but it's not found in nature like a disease. Okay. And then the second problem is they told us the story about drugs that fix chemical imbalances in the brain. But if you actually research that, which is a story of a great advance, that's an infectious disease type story, right? You know the pathology. Antidepressants are depression is due to too little serotonin. The drugs fix that, like insulin for diabetes. That's an infectious disease story in essence. Or if not an infectious disease, it's an internal medicine story. So in other words, you know the pathology and you have something that fixes it. But in psychiatry, the chemical imbalance story arose from an understanding of how the drugs acted on the brain. So for example, they learned that antidepressants block the normal reuptake of serotonin. They kept serotonin in those synaptic gaps longer than normal. It was upping serotonergic activity. So they hypothesized, this goes back to the 1960s, that maybe the depression is due to little serotonin. Okay, makes sense. But now you have to investigate. Do people with depression have low serotonin before they go on the drugs? They began doing those tests in the early 1980s. And in 1984, the National Institute of Mental Health, which is our leading research organization in the country, part of the National Institute of Health, said, we're just not finding that people with depression have low serotonin before they go on these pills. In 1998, the American Psychiatric Association's own textbook said that hypothesis, the low serotonin hypothesis, hasn't panned out. But were you told that? Was the public told that? Instead, we were told in advertisements, and by the way, on the website of the American Psychiatric Association, we now know that depression is due to low serotonin, and the drugs fix that abnormality like insulin for diabetes. So it's not just that things have been exaggerated. It's basically, even after a hypothesis was investigated and found not to be true, they still told this to the public. And by the way, a lot of people, even when they went to medical school, began hearing of this. And by the way, this is a story that gets you to take the drugs forever, right? You have a chronic problem, and you can't really do anything about it. You can't change your environment at all because the problem is inside your head with your neurotransmitters. Anyway, that story was very effective in marketing depression and marketing antidepressants, but it wasn't a story founded in science. And by the way, last thing, when I first started reporting on this, I reported that they had found that the chemical imbalances were the causes of major mental disorders, because when I called people up, that's what they told me. And what happened is, one time I said on the phone, can you just tell me where in the research literature you found that people with depression have too little serotonin? And here's what they told me. Oh, we didn't really find that. It's just a metaphor we use to get people to take their drugs. And I'm saying, well, you're not supposed to lie to patients that they have a biological problem in order to take a drug. So that was really the moment as a journalist, I said, I've got to go into the scientific literature and see what's really in the scientific literature.
It's amazing because, you delved into it in an investigative way. I can see why you won that award for investigative journalism. And the importance of this, to me, as you're speaking, the importance of this to the country is huge because, as you said, it took something away from being handled by the person in their familial or community environment, their school or workplace. And now all of a sudden, there was nothing they could do about it because it was, like you said, it was in their brains, so they were going to be doomed for the rest of their lives. That's such a horrible. That I have that right, or?
No, that's exactly what happened. And for you, I've talked to so many patients. They said this: something went wrong in their life. Okay, something happened to them. Maybe they got divorced, or they were struggling a bit in school. All these things that setbacks can happen. And then they said they heard this chemical imbalance story. They went to their doctor, and they got the diagnosis and the prescription from the psychiatrist. And you know what many of them said? My hope for a normal life vanished at that time because I realized there was something wrong inside me.
Wow.
So rather than give the message to someone that, life has its up and downs, you can change your environment, make changes in your life, and, that there is an inner resilience, the thought was, all I can do is take this drug. And then we can go, but one of the problems is, of course, taking the drug doesn't fix what might be amiss in your life. But that's part of the problem. And just, you mentioned the harm. And when you're opening, you talked about when you were a kid. You goofed off sometimes, right? You got in trouble sometimes, right?
That's what we did.
Yeah. And sometimes you didn't like school. At least that was my thing. Sometimes I was so bored with school. But that was just seen as something as maybe it'll pass and kids will be kids, that sort of thing. It wasn't that you were mentally ill. Well, now think about this in terms of harm done. Somewhere between 25 and 30% of our kids who arrive in colleges now have a diagnosis and a prescription for a drug. So that's the percentage of kids we're now convincing that they have a mental illness. And, and I can't tell you how many kids would just say, like, I was 15 and, I got jilted or something like that, or 16, or, I just got tired of school, and all of a sudden they're pushed down this path of having a mental illness, and that's what's happened for so many of our population.
It's horrific because I think back, and I ended up being the valedictorian of my dental school here in New York. I got 9 of 27 awards when I graduated, but I tell you the story only for this. When I was at the University of Connecticut, in organic chemistry, I got a little lost. So I wanted some extra help. And I went to get extra help. I won't say his last name out of courtesy and respect, although I'd like to, but I won't. And I went to see this professor. And after being with a professor, he cleared up some things I was confused about. I was happy. And he says to me, Bernard, you're never going to make it in professional school. And I see you're pre-med, pre-dent, so you should try something else. And I walked out of there, and I could have taken it, and he could have destroyed me. And like you said, maybe at that point, it was 1978. So there was, we didn't have that problem. But I guess if it was now, I would think I had a mental disorder. I would go on drugs, and that'd be the end of my life. And because of some insane statement that was not true, and actually turned in reverse. But that's an amazing statistic you're saying. let me ask you what may be too ridiculous a question to ask you. What do you feel, in your opinion, because you've been involved in investigating this, what's the future of our country going to be like if a quarter to 30% of our youth are on drugs already?
Well, in a way, the data even gets worse. More than 50% of kids in college now seek out counseling and help for mental, difficulties. More than 50%.
Wow.
Well, listen, during the course of their 4 years, they'll access mental health services. Listen, it's a real problem for the country, of course, because the message is a message of, it's sort of the can't do message, right? And it's sort of like, you're flawed, something's wrong with you. And there isn't a message that, what happened to you, your anecdote? You left there probably more determined than ever to show that you could become a medical student, right?
Right.
And so basically you went into yourself and you found a strength there. You found a motivation there, a determination there. But that's because you were raised in an environment where you understood that was a possibility, right? I'm sure you got that from your parents. And I'm willing to bet your parents didn't want to hear excuses either, right? The message to you, as when you were growing up, the message was make something of yourself. You have an opportunity to make yourself, right? Now this story's totally different. It's like, oh, you've got a problem. That's why you're unhappy or whatever it means. We're taking away from the national character, because of this psychiatrization of us, this philosophical conception of you can get knocked down, but you can get back up. And you're not going to be perfect as a kid. And you know what? You may screw off sometimes in kids, but you still have every opportunity now to organize yourself and be successful as you grow up. But that's the conception we have of ourselves is so important to how the nation goes forward, right? What our capacities are, our capabilities are, our strengths are, our resilience. And we've lost that message and replaced it with it. Oh, we're also like vulnerable. We can't really manage our emotions. We're weakening our national character. So what's happening with this psychiatrization of the society? That's my opinion.
It's very interesting because I see that, and as a surgeon, that's why I started to do an anti-illicit drug education program about 18 years ago, because I saw in family, I saw in patients that for whatever reason, because there was marijuana when I was in high school. It's not like,
Sure,
there wasn't around, and it wasn't like I didn't see it. Let's be real. One of my good friends, unfortunately, never made it as a professional football player because he got kicked out of Ohio State, but he was a great football player. He could have made it. And that was marijuana, THC level 1 or 2, at the most 3. Now we look at 15, 25, 30% without vaping it, and we're legalizing it. I sometimes look at this and I go, where is our leadership and where is our mindset in our country? I totally agree with you. Tell me something. Go ahead.
Well, just one quick thing on marijuana. If you were to go into psychiatric emergency rooms today, and you see first episode psychotic patients come into your psychiatric emergency room, you'll find that there's a lot of substance use before they have their first break. It's marijuana. It's other, more powerful drugs. It's also, by the way, sometimes drugs like antidepressants can stir sort of a manic episode as well. But my point is, you happen to say something about marijuana. Well, marijuana does increase the risk that you're going to have a psychiatric episode. It doesn't mean it happens to everybody, but it does increase the risk, and it is showing up as a problem among young kids. By the 18, and when they hit it, they'll have a bad time on it, end up at an emergency room. And then when they go to the emergency room, they get diagnosed now with a psychiatric disorder and treated with a drug. So the truth of the matter is, and this is not a popular thing to say, but that marijuana does carry the risk of having a difficult time that'll lend itself to a psychiatric diagnosis.
Very interesting. You know, let me ask you to try to get to people watching the show are going to say, okay, but wow, what do I do? So let's give them some positive. So let me ask you a question. In terms of non-pharmacologic, or even you already talked about the concept and different philosophies we used to have, which makes a lot of sense of being active, getting up when you're knocked down. So what do you feel is the realm or the possibilities or the potential of, let's say, sports, of nutrition, of familial connections? Talk a little bit about that for us.
Well, and we always hear about the evidence base for interventions, medical interventions, right? And there's been a lot of research, in fact, showing that environment is so important for people, and environment does include everything you talk about. Being out in nature, but there was just a study the other day that if you have access to a green space every day growing up, your risk of developing psychosis later in life is reduced a little bit. So nature is seen as a balm for people, being out in nature. Sports, of course. Why is sports good for you? Well, of course, there's a sense of a feeling of competence when you can play a sport well. There's a form of being part of a team, camaraderie, and there's also you're just in better shape, right? You're moving around, that sort of thing. So all the things you talk, and I was just reading this story today. I think it was in the New York Times about eating Sunday dinners in Italy, where you had the whole family around. And my point of this is that's what you're talking about: family relationships, social relationships, where you're communicating and talking with people, and you feel part of a larger community. And think about the difference in conception. Oh, and by the way, at schools, do you know that in schools, if they get the kids outside to play a lot, you'll get less ADHD. There are studies where, in fact, if you teach them how to eat better, cook for themselves, and not just eat crap all the time, that can reduce your problem of behavioral problems in school. So what you're putting your finger on this is this. What do you know about being alive? And being a human being born? You're responsive to your environment, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, and if my environment gets problematic, I'm not feeling so well. And if I stop playing sports, I start being active, or I have a relationship problem. All those things make me feel bad. That's because we humans are built to be responsive to our environment. And there's all sorts of research showing that if you change environments in the way you're talking about, nutrition, activity, sports, getting people to volunteer. I know a person who runs a psychologist for Connecticut. He takes people coming out of mental hospitals, and when he does this, he says, I'll give you an hour of psychotherapy for free if you volunteer for 2 hours per week. Now, the minute they volunteer, what happens? They're helping others now. They're not the one being helped. So this is a long-winded answer to say there's all sorts of research that shows that if you try to change the environment the person is in, change what is called the social determinants of health, that can be very effective both over sort of the short term, but even more effective over the long term. It builds this resilience, a sense of competence, and a different life going forward. But that's not what we're doing when we focus all on the drugs, right? The drugs are supposed to be the cure. But if you want to do evidence-based psychiatry, try and change the environment that people are living in. What went wrong with that environment, and how can we build more nurturing environments?
Very interesting. You know what? Since there's been such a redefining of terms and terminology over the years, I would say evidence-based humanity, or evidence-based, scientific spirituality, so that we keep it really based, like you said. I mean, when I do work in someone's mouth, I base what I'm doing on bone healing, on soft tissue healing, and the antibiotics, obviously, to help them not get infection. But I don't just throw things in there for the sake. Unfortunately, some in the profession do, and they have to be corrected. But it's not what we're taught. It's not the way to be taught. So I totally agree with you. Where do you feel, because I think we're reaching the end of our show, and I would love for the show to go on forever. It's so important for our country. Where do you feel we should head? What do you think needs to happen so that we start waking our country up? What needs to happen?
Literally, I think we need to rethink what it means to be human. I know, because basically what we've been sold, I know that sounds grandiose, but what we've been sold is this sort of mechanistic vision of people. Oh, you have these chemicals in your brain and they determine how you feel and how you think and all that sort of thing. And we've lost the sense that human beings are, bodily people who move through an environment. And by the way, just so you know, the United Nations Special Rapporteur for Health, a Lithuanian psychiatrist named Dainius Purus, said, we got to rethink this thing. We got to move away from this biological model and towards a social model, because we really understand what do people really need. And the World Health Organization, by the way, also has now published 2 documents saying we need a revolution, and we need to rethink this, and we need to learn from other societies, and societies are still maintaining older ways and all, about how you help people get well and stay well, and how do you raise your children too, so they're not so anxious and so miserable by the time, so often like feeling they're incapable by the time they hit college, that sort of thing. So you asked me what we need to do. We need sort of a reconceptualization of what it means to be human and what it means to be a child. And if we do that, and we have this reconceptualization of like, people are responsive to their environment, but they're also so filled with the capacity to endure, to change their lives, to overcome obstacles, to go through difficult periods. And let's get that sense of self back into us. And I don't know, that's what's needed. It's this utter transformation in philosophy of being that we need now.
Absolutely. I totally agree with you. And to me, you asked a question before, and I'll tell you a funny story. One day I was in high school, and you were totally correct. I was complaining to my mother. It was in the kitchen. I grew up in Connecticut. And, she was telling me about something that she felt I had potential to do. And I said, no. That's genetic with those guys. Those 2 guys, they do that, and I can't do that, and that's genetic, and I'm not interested. And so she goes, no. The reason is, I have to modify a little bit what she said to me, so to make it more possible to put on television. She goes, the reason is because you, my dear boy, my son, are not willing to sit in that chair on your behind, she used other words, more. And if you do, you will accomplish. Well, I always told my mother, she passed away a few years ago, but she was 90 something, lived a good life. And I always told her, I said, you know something? What you told me that day in high school, I applied. And that's how I ended up getting all the honors that I did in University of Connecticut, going past what that professor told me, being the valedictorian at the dental school, going on to speak at the United Nations 6 to 8 times already on drugs. And, by sitting, like she said, with a little discipline, and like you said, overcoming obstacles and having goals, we've reached the end of the show. And at the end of the show, I always ask my invited guest, what would you like to say to those people watching as we end this show tonight?
The biggest message is this: we have an incredible inner resilience in us. We have an incredible ability that is just within human beings to overcome difficulties. It sometimes takes time, but you need to think of yourself in that way, as someone that can exert willpower, change your life, and overcome obstacles. That's more than anything, is recover that sense of faith and belief in yourself.
Beautiful. I wholeheartedly agree with you. It's been an utter pleasure having you on the show. And for those of you watching, let's really heed Mr. Whitaker's advice. Let's realize who we are, that we're not machines, we're not biologically motivated chemicals. We're a human being. We have desires, we have tremendous potential, tremendous energy, and let's stop labeling each other. Let's stop labeling in general. Let's actually get back our, as he said, our humanity. Let's get back what the U.S. Surgeon General just recently wrote about the importance of the reality, the scientific proof of the fact that we are social human beings and that our community diseases and our physical and mental diseases are actually coming from the lack of humanity interaction. Let's do that. I hope you've enjoyed the show. I've thoroughly enjoyed having you on the show, Mr. Whitaker.
Thanks for having me.
I salute you. We'll see you on the next episode of A Time for Truth show. Good night.
This show was sponsored by A Time for Truth Foundation Incorporated as a community service.
Sometimes life can be so damn hard. You don't know where to go. Everything keeps falling apart. Yeah. You try to do your best, but only God knows that you've given everything you've got, but the world takes you down. You just keep moving on. Let your feet